Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Today we're pleased to present Building Products Customers Love. I'm Jeanette DePatty from the Lean Startup Conference happening November 16th through 19th in San Francisco. Visit leanstartup.co for more information. Our speakers today are Tom Wynn and Kirsten Cluthy, who will be moderating questions from the audience. Tom Wynn is a principal at Adobe overseeing product management for next-generation creative tools. He is pioneering new product design and development approaches and launched Adobe's first product using lean methodologies. Tom created and leads Adobe Voice, a visual storytelling tool now used by millions. Yahoo tech editor David Pogue called it one of the simplest, most creative, most joyous apps ever written. Apple named it one of the best apps of the year. Previously, Tom oversaw video and gaming products at Adobe used by over 1.3 billion people. He also managed social media and strategy at Reuters and taught design thinking at Reuters Innovation Studio in New York and London. While there, Tom launched the first user-generated news service at a global news agency, and he was selected as an Emmy Award finalist for his work in interactive media. Tom also serves on the board of Inforum at the Commonwealth Club, the largest and longest-running public forum in the United States. He holds a bachelor's degree in computer science from Stanford University, an MA in education from Stanford, and an MBA from the Stanford Graduate School of Business. He gets excited about great stories, traveling, and eating things he can't name, and colorful, interlocking Danish bricks. Kirsten Cluthy is the editorial director for the Lean Startup Conference. Here's a few housekeeping notes. We'll take questions from the audience via the live chat. If you'd like to ask a question, please flag it with the letter Q followed by a colon. The speakers will answer questions throughout the webcast. There's no need to ask your questions twice. This is a 1-hour program, and the recording will be available a few days after this live webcast. Take it away, Kirsten.
Thanks, Jeanette. Hi, Tom. How are you? Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
It's great. So to get started, why don't we talk a little bit about your work at Adobe? Can you tell us what you do? What's your day like?
Sure. So I'm a principal at Adobe, looking after product management there. So we have this group that Jeanette mentioned, Next Generation Creative Tools, and there we're kind of thinking. So of course, Adobe makes a lot of great tools for amazing creative folks, Photoshop and Illustrator and Premiere, and if you're seeing something visual in the world, there's a good chance that an Adobe tool has touched it. And so we're kind of looking at how do we expand that to help more people, so that folks even beyond folks that have had 4 years of design school or film school and those kinds of amazing artistic folks, thinking about everybody else, how can we help everybody else create things that are visually beautiful, narratively impactful, basically thinking about how do we democratize storytelling so everybody can tell stories well?
Great. So what's your approach when you're designing a product? What do you think about as you start something new?
Yeah. So generally, I'm a very positive person, but in the context of product, all I can think about are problems, and in particular, the problems that people have. I think thinking about one of the things we use and talk about and apply quite a bit is this notion of empathetic design. And a big part of empathy is understanding the problems that people have. And I think the root of pretty much every great product has been the right problem for the right person. And so the genesis of a lot of the work that we do comes from thinking about who are these groups that have big, significant, meaty problems, and what can we do to make their lives better. So in the case of Voice, so Voice is just kind of real quick. It's Adobe Voice is an iPad app. It's free to download, free to use. Basically lets people make quick animated explainer videos. So there's 90-second, 2-minute videos you've probably seen on every organization's website or product website that says this is what we do, or this is who we're trying to help, and this is what we're this is how to make things better, and here's some call to action. Those videos, we found a lot of people wanted to make those videos because they're super effective. And so there's kind of background research into that, and talking to lots of folks outside the buildings. One of the big things from Lean that that we've kind of internalized and really taken to heart. And when you do that, you find oh yeah, people are paying $10,000, $50,000 to make a 2-minute video. And for a lot of folks, so they do it, and it's incredibly worthwhile because those videos get like 20% better conversion, like they make things more, their pages and their products more effective. But what about everybody else, right? There are so many organizations, think of like nonprofits or small businesses, that want to be able to do that too. And so that was kind of the genesis of Voice, is this big problem of like, how do you communicate an idea in an impactful way online? And how do we make that easier so it's cheaper and faster and more fun?
So I want to just talk about that a little bit more, because I'm curious about how you got to, that's a very specific problem to solve.
Yeah.
So how did you even get to that point? Because were you thinking about doing something else, and then you found that that was actually what people needed, or how did you get there?
Actually, so it's funny. So mentioned like Voice has been interesting because it's really it's been awesome that it's turned out well and millions of people are using it and it's like, beloved in the App Store. But it's actually the first time we've really released a commercial product like from start to finish using Lean. So I can talk about the kind of traditional way we've done things. Adobe is an awesome company, I think. I'm biased, but it's also a 33-year-old company, right? A 33-year-old software company. Like products like Photoshop, I think it just had its 25th anniversary. Like these are long-standing things, and for us to build like entirely new products, entirely new solutions for an entirely new group of people, not just creative professionals and designers and artists, but thinking about a retired grandmother who's starting a small business, or thinking about somebody who's an 18-year-old volunteer at a nonprofit. Like that's a very different audience. So we actually started honestly like not in the best way. So before I joined the team, we actually had some cool technology, which is a lot of how in the real world, at least in like a big technology company, a lot of things start that way. And so our amazing engineering team had like this way to do like high performance motion graphics and animation that could run like on an iPad or an iPhone. And they're like, wow, this is really cool technology. And so like the first initial steps were like, oh, well, we have like desktop tools that do animation. We'll just like take that UI and like simplify it and shove it onto an iPad. And we have this cool technology that lets this all run in real time on an iPad. And it's like, okay, that's like, it's one of those like, oh yeah, the bear can walk, I guess. That's impressive. But it wasn't, again, solving a problem for people. Like nobody, like our professional designers weren't saying like, oh, I wish I could do like real-time Hollywood motion graphics with a timeline and keyframes on my iPad. Like you'll see like contrived ads sometimes, like, oh yeah, like if I'm on an airplane and I don't have my computer, maybe I could do that. Like it's just not really a problem for folks. And so when I joined, so we had this kind of nascent technology, which is awesome. It's kind of figuring out like, so what is the problem is kind of how I was framing it. Like, and who are we trying to help? So we were talking a lot about like helping these next generation creatives, so like people, everybody else basically, not creative professionals. And so it's just me talking to a lot of folks. So I'd actually like go out to, so I came from a background in education, and education and nonprofits were actually really interesting for us because they had so many constraints. So as we were trying to build tools for more people, like in education nonprofit space, like they have less time than most folks because they're doing a million things, and it's like one volunteer who's wearing 5 different hats of like social media manager and marketing person and like copy editor, and they're also like raising money. And they don't have a lot of resources, and they don't necessarily have a lot of like design skill that they've learned from like years of design school. So that was just kind of a perfect, we talk about like extreme users, like kind of on the edge, where they kind of hit the intersection of so many different kind of challenges and problems. And so talking to them, that's basically how I uncovered this problem of explainer videos being such an appealing thing to be able to make, because they see like other people doing it, but so far out of reach because they don't have skill, time, resources to do it. So I was like, wait, okay, like this timeline thing on an iPad is not going to solve that problem. Like this super busy person is not going to take like a month of their time to read a bunch of books or take a class on how to do motion graphics. This isn't going to work. But what if we could simplify that and get to the essence of things? And that was pretty much the genesis of Voice.
So you said it was the first product that you applied the Lean Startup method to building all the way through. So how did you get to the Lean Startup method? Why did it make sense to apply that in this case?
Yeah, so that's interesting. So before even before I was at Adobe, I was at Stanford doing weird things, but so I was doing a program that was like a mix of, so I was doing an MBA, and then later I did a degree in education and design. And in both those places, I didn't know what it would be called at that time. But in business school, we'd learn about like lean production methodologies and like the Toyota production system, and we'd have case studies about this. And it's like, oh, this is really cool, and it was like super innovative. But I was kind of thinking like, okay, like if I ever run a factory of widgets, this is going to be great. Like, and hadn't thought about it in a software context or like a technology product context. And at the same time, at the D School, we're doing a lot of work in terms of like rapid prototyping and iteration. Like fundamentally, the core principles of like people-centered design, studying at the D School or a place like IDEO, it's empathy, understanding your customer, understanding your user, and then rapid prototyping to like not just describe things to people, but actually show like you can't just ask questions of people and expect them to give you answers. Like, oh, what product would you like us to build? Like, it's not their job to design a product for you. That's your job. Your job is to understand their needs and then synthesize a solution. You may be wrong. That's okay, because you're going to rapidly prototype it and find out really quickly if it's right or wrong or what's right and wrong. And then third thing is you iterate, right? And that's the design process in a nutshell. And so these two kind of separate things from the D School and the business school, kind of like, okay, these are like useful things to have in the back of mind. When I came to Adobe, it's try to apply like bits and pieces of it, and then kind of started stumbling on Lean, just kind of hearing about it, and it's like, wait, this is that perfect synthesis of like a methodology and a design process and a process of like understanding customers and your business that kind of all coalesced. So one of the cool things at Adobe is we've been like our upper management's been super receptive to trying new methodologies and new approaches, and so there was a big movement around these next generation tools to really dig deep into Lean Startup, and so we're all reading it. We all had actually great help from folks at Neo, so Jonathan Irwin, Dave Bland. Those guys are great. So they're introducing us to some of these concepts, and then we just kind of ran with it. Honestly, it was a little bit hard, so introducing totally new process to like a big company is like not always the easiest thing. And at Adobe, like we definitely had like executive support, which is great, but it's actually funny because like the actual team, like amazing veteran engineers who built like amazing legendary products, like some of those were the hardest people to like get on board onto Lean. It's like, we know what we're doing, like we've done this well for like years and years and years. Like, why do we want to mix things up and do this? And actually, so at the beginning, it was a lot of, I think in a lot of other groups, there was a very like top-down, like you're going to go like learn Lean, and like you have to come to these meetings and have to come to these like customer things, and it's a very like push model. And what ended up, I think, kind of finally converting everybody over was kind of more of a pull model, basically. Like actually doing, instead of like describing all the benefits, just going and doing it. So like talking to customers, getting insights, building small little prototypes, and like as that kept on happening, as we kind of got better and better and a little more successful at that, that's what actually ended up getting like everybody bought in. So it's not always like just convincing the people at the top, but really think about convincing. How are you going to convince your team? And the best way to do that is stories of like the own little micro successes that you've gotten along the way.
So when you talk about stories, are you talking about the data that you get?
Yeah. So the data that you get back, and actually told with a framework of stories. So when I talk about stories, I mean, typically, if you think about stories like the classic like hero's journey, like Joseph Campbell, Star Wars, or Harry Potter, there's a hero. There's some situation. They're stuck in a tree. They have some problem, and they need to get out of that tree. Bad things happen to them. There's more problems, and eventually, like they uncover some solution or understanding that gets them out, right? And like basically every story is about like a protagonist who has a problem who eventually overcomes. And so using that framing to describe like the data that we were getting, so whether that's qualitative or quantitative data, was super valuable. So specific example was at some point, the Voice, one of the things we've like really proud of is the UI of Voice, and like it's super, like you can literally make an impactful video in like 15 minutes. It's super easy. It's fun. Like 8-year-olds are using it to make like amazing like poetry slams and things. But at the beginning, there was a debate with engineering about whether so Voice automatically will help you download Creative Commons assets from like libraries. So you get like millions of photos and icons that kind of fit what you're saying without having to like Google search for them. and it works really quickly because it works really quickly, especially like on an internal network like ours. And there's a push, like I wanted to get like better feedback, so like progress indicators. We should take time to do like those progress indicators. And people are like, no, that's like not MVP, like that's not important. It's like, and we could just have this back and forth debate like over and over again. But instead, so I just go out to there's a public school in Oakland. Like I was going there like each week. I'd go out to different places to do kind of user studies and so we had the students, like fourth graders, with 10, 15 iPads that they were sharing, like using this tool, and they're loving it. And then they get to the part where they're downloading their images, and then like suddenly like all the kids' hands would be like up in the air, like, oh, there's like the app like crashed, it's frozen. It wasn't crashed or frozen. It was you had like 30 kids downloading images all at the same time on the world's slowest like public school Wi-Fi network, right? And that's something that like we wouldn't have seen like sitting at like Adobe HQ with their fast Ethernet connection. But that's like a real world problem, like a big problem. And so whereas I couldn't convince engineers to just like, please put in the progress indicator, like it's really important and do it this way, by telling that story, like, okay, yeah, we need to do that. Like those 30 kids are pissed off at us right now. Let's fix that. And so talking about the data that you have through the lens of a person, your user, is such a powerful thing, both in you helping your own understanding, but also like getting buy-in from your team, and like everybody who touches the product.
So how long did it take you? How many experiments did you run? How many times did you have to
go
gosh.
A lot.
Are you still iterating? How is it?
We never stop iterating. And I think I would lose track. So one of the things we talk about, it's a little bit meta. One of the big ideas in the app is like the reason why is this big principle that iteration makes everything better, right? And your high school English teacher would tell you that. Like certainly mine did. She's like, it's never your first draft. It's your 5th draft that's going to be the best. It's your 20th draft that's going to be the best. But in practice, like I would never do a 5th draft because like I'm too lazy. Like I would not write like a 5th draft of my English essay. But if I did, it would be great. And so thinking about that, like that's true. Like more iteration, like more drafts will make things better, especially as you're getting feedback from people along the way. So the question is like, how can you shorten those cycles, right? Like if it's super painful to write another draft of this like long English essay, like I'm not going to do it. But if you can figure out ways to shorten and condense that, so that each cycle is shorter, it's not so bad to iterate really quickly. So with Voice, for example, we were down to like 1-week sprints. Every week we would have a different specific experiment, like a specific hypothesis that we had. Like if we add this, if we do a better onboarding experience with this like walkthrough tutorial, like people are more likely to get successfully publishing at the end. Defining that and then like running that experiment and seeing the result. That was something that would happen like every week. So I don't know, it took about Voice, I think, was like 1.5 years. So like 1.5 years, like however many weeks are in that, that's at least how many like iterative cycles we went through, and we continue to do that. And one of the things about those iterative cycles, it comes back to, I mentioned before, like in design thinking, there's this notion of like rapid prototyping, and like people will build models out of like cardboard and construction paper because that's the fastest thing that they have, instead of using a CNC machine or some like 3D model and 3D printer, just because it's the fastest way to get it out. And so that's what we were doing with Voice as well. So for example, if we were testing something like I mentioned, like the onboarding experience, the one way of doing it is like, oh, okay, we'll have like design like the proper onboarding experience, and then we'll have like engineering like implement that, and then we'll test it. And like that's, unless you have some crazy team like working all night, all hours, like you're not going to do that in a week. But instead, like the experiment might just be like walking people in, and like you personally, or have a person walk them through the onboarding flow that like Wizard of Oz style, essentially. Just kind of walk them through the steps that the app would have walked them through and see how it does. And yeah, it's like slightly different. It's people are probably more likely to do it if there's a physical person there, but at least you're getting some approximation if this like onboarding concept might work at all. And so that's totally something you could do in a week, even like a few days. So get those smaller cycles, you'll get more iteration, and you'll get something closer to what users need.
So what were some of the other challenges that you ran into when you were building this, other than the sort of getting the engineering team on board?
Yeah. So one of them was that, one of the reasons folks are a little bit skeptical of Lean at Adobe and like myself included, a little bit myself included, was that like, oh, well, we've seen all these like great case studies and examples like from actual startups, but like a big company is different. Like we have like brand to think about, and I think somebody was asking about that. Like we have the Adobe brand, like we have to think about. So if we make a crappy creative tool, like that's not good. Like so we're not going to be able to do like the lean, like quick, rapid things that startups are always talking about. And so we actually did. So Voice was actually launched. So we kind of like worked around it. We were like, okay, so we'll use like project code names and things like that. We were nervous about it, but we actually, so the original code name for Adobe Voice was Project Ginger. And so we had this website, I think it's still up in some residual form, but like getginger.co. So when people were like, oh, okay, you should like do like a validation website and test some of like some of the test our 6 up, for example, like what is this offering to people? We're like, okay, like we can do that, but if we do that, like what if people find out we're Adobe? But we eventually kind of overcame that hurdle, and we did it anyway. So it got super valuable feedback. Like actually, if you, I think getginger.co, you can still see the 6 up, the key value propositions that we were talking about, and it maps perfectly to actually what we released and what ended up being so successful. This is again, that's probably the 30th draft of that page if you're seeing it right now. Like there's so many other versions before. Or like, what's the worst thing that could happen? Like, what if somebody finds out that it's actually Adobe, like underlying this like little stealth project? Like, oh my gosh, it's going to be like a PR nightmare. So guess what happens? Like, like a few months later, a CNET writer writes this post that like Adobe is working on secret PowerPoint killer like related to called Ginger. Like, oh, like we saw this in the morning and we're like, oh no, we're screwed. This is the worst thing that could happen. And yeah, so like the worst case scenario we had been thinking about in doing lean at like a big company actually happened. Like people found out that like the stealth project was actually an Adobe thing. Like people were talking about it. There's like an Engadget post I saw in my like RSS feed. Like, oh no, this is like big. And at the end of, and so it ended up the reason that happened apparently was because we were sending out beta invites, and like the footer of one of those emails had like an anti-spam thing that had like our address, and it was like Adobe at 601 Townsend, San Francisco. And so people connected the dots, as journalists connect the dots. It was like, oh, this is Adobe. So what ended up happening, we were like, oh yeah, like Adobe runs like experiments all the time to figure out like what people are like, how to build products that users are looking for. And like, you know, there's no guarantee they'll actually be products, but this is one of many experiments that we're always running. And that was it. And actually, it was awesome because we ended up getting like thousands of people who were signed up for our beta list that we like siphoned into a separate place because these are the people that know it's Adobe. But it was actually great. We got a lot more testers, a lot more beta testers. We got a lot more feedback, and altogether it wasn't so bad. So you know, that big challenge. You think about like, oh, it's big, it's different at a big company versus a small company. Actually, you know, people know that big companies are running experiments all the time. So if you're going to do it, like, you know, use methodologies like Lean and do it well. Like the downside isn't such a bad thing.
Yeah, it sounds like it worked in your favor.
Yeah, it actually, yeah, yeah. So it made it so much easier to get feedback from folks. Like, yeah, we like inflated our like test list by like an order of magnitude. One thing to keep in mind, of course, is that like, we did know that those users were different than the users we were targeting, because those are people who are like coming in now expecting like, oh, this is like Adobe and this is a PowerPoint killer, which it is not. Like that's not our intent. It's an app to create like explainer videos, not like presentations necessarily. But yeah, so it just made it that much easier to get more feedback from more folks at the end of the day. And after we kind of overcame that hurdle, you know, there was really nothing else to be afraid of. And so the process, I mean, we made all kinds of mistakes, but the process was super smooth, and at least no different between like doing it at Adobe versus doing it like, at a two-man startup.
So is the company more comfortable now?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. So Adobe. So like I described a little bit like, oh, you know, like Adobe being big corporate, but actually like Adobe's been super supportive like all along the way. It's been remarkable about that, and it continues to apply Lean across like all kinds of different dimensions on new projects. There's actually, so after Voice, this one hasn't been released yet, so I probably shouldn't talk too much about it, but did another like lean kind of validation experiment, and it went incredibly well. And so that's going to be the basis of like a new product that we'll be launching I think next year. And so it's an ongoing thing. This definitely wasn't a one-shot. The idea of kind of pioneering lean with a handful of these projects, like Voice being the first of those, has definitely like disseminated across the company, and both like executive management and just like the teams themselves are excited to get closer to customers. So it's been awesome.
That's great. That's very cool. Sorry, I'm echoing. So I'm going to try this without. I wanted to ask you why people call the product joyful. What do you mean?
So that is a good. So joyful. So I think it's because you actually see. I mean, people have used it from the Secretary General of the United Nations. His envoy uses Voice to like create videos that report back about like meetings and discussions they're having in Cairo and Brussels, like in places all around the world. And then, so that's like adults, and then you have like a 6th grader who's making a video about river conservation in New York City, and it's now being used as like one of the official videos for this nonprofit like environmental organization in New York, and it's a 6th grader, right? So like this huge range of folks. The idea, I think everybody wants to be able to tell stories. Like we all want to have a voice. But it's been hard but there's this huge gap between like the stories that we consume, like watching YouTube and viral videos and Hollywood stuff, and the things that we can actually make ourselves. And so the goal of Voice from the very beginning is like to close that gap, to make it easier for folks. And so like the reason why it's fun, like you watch, if you just search for like Adobe Voice like on Twitter, for some reason like the education community has been super excited. So like you're invariably going to see a bunch of adorable photos of like kids doing like poetry slams and like advertisements and projects in their like 6th grade class or their 4th grade class or their like high school class. And the reason it's fun is because it's fast and it's frictionless. So it's kind of a little meta because it relates a little bit to lean actually. But I mentioned before how important iteration is. Iteration makes everything easier. If you look at the toys, so like I'm a total nerd. Ever since I was a little kid, I've been playing with Legos. Actually, Legos. They're like all around the room. Legos are amazing. Like you watch kids play with Legos, it's joyful. One of the reasons it's joyful is because it's iterative. Like a kid can she's thinking about like, okay, she wants to build like a giant skyscraper. She doesn't have to create a blueprint or a plan to build that skyscraper. She just starts snapping bricks together, one brick at a time. If it doesn't look quite right, she snaps them apart, puts on another piece. And so the whole time, like every iterative step, like literally takes like 1 second. And so she doesn't have to plan. She's just like in the moment, in that flow. So with Voice, it's the same idea. The big kind of benefit of Voice, like big idea of Voice, is, so basically, let me describe it. So you take your iPad, you talk into it like a walkie-talkie. If you think about doing like a narration for a video, in the old days, if you recorded a 60-second narration for your video, like at the 49th second you cough, and you're like, no, and just start all over again. Or figure out how to use a waveform editor and edit, and it's going to take you tons of time. In Voice, like you just press and hold and talk like a walkie-talkie. So like once upon a time. Oh no, that wasn't quite right. You just press and hold it again. Once upon a time. Like more energy. Once upon a time. And so because it's so easy to just like do a retake and do it over again, it literally takes 2 seconds, just like snapping on a Lego piece. You keep on doing it. You get in the flow, and you end up with something that sounds amazing. Like we've seen like 8-year-olds using Voice who are like practicing that like once upon a time, like literally taking 10 takes of the same thing. And then they do that for each of their little lines, and then when you play it back all together, she sounded like Obama. Like for people to be perfect for 2 seconds at a time, it's not that hard. Everybody can do that. And so if we take the pain of editing out so that it's just quick and easy to like, if you want to throw in an image, it takes in 2 seconds. If you want to say something, it takes 2 seconds. And that whole process like just keeps you in the flow of your story. And I think that's what makes it so joyful. Just like snapping on bricks and Lego is like so joyful.
So what's interesting to me is the timing of the story. Did you storyboard it? Did you practice it? How did you get to it? Take like 2 minutes everybody can speak for 2 minutes, and then you break it up, and you sort of figured out how people tell stories.
Oh yeah. So yeah. So in terms of how do people come up with those stories? So one of the big ideas is we're going to take. So there's kind of two parts to creating a video story, for example. You've got to have the actual story narrative, and then you have to have production, right? To actually create the video and things like that. Most Adobe tools, most creative tools in general, have always been focused on production, right? Move this thing 2 pixels up, 2 pixels down, change it plus 2 seconds, plus minus 5 seconds. What's the color? What's the font? All these production details. And basically, we've put people in the position of oh yeah, you want to make a movie? Well, you're going to be the set designer and the choreographer who's moving stuff around. My big thing with voice is I wanted to make a tool where people, most people, they don't want to be this, it's cool to be a set designer and a set designer or choreographer. They do beautiful things, but most people probably just want to be the director. Make this big. This is the exciting part, or oh, this is the quiet part. And so that's the big idea of voice, is that we were going to take all those production details. Technology can take care of that. We'll do beautiful motion graphics and motion blur, and things will drop in 3D and paint in with a watercolor effect. Technology can take care of that. And we're just going to let you focus on the story, the things that directors should worry about, right? And so, to help you with that story, we actually, in my geeky kind of education background, we talk about instructional scaffolding, which is the idea that instead of you build scaffolds for people, and they can climb up those scaffolds, and they can get higher than they would have gotten themselves, and they can build better things than they could have built by themselves. So in Voice, we have a lot of scaffolding. One example is that onboarding process I was mentioning. It actually gives people example story arcs. So we know from a lot of research in history and literature, there are narrative arcs that have been really effective. So the hero's journey, right? You have a hero, she has a challenge, she has some obstacles to overcome, and then she brings home some valuable lesson back to the village, right? That story has been told a million times in a million ways because it's over time, because it's so effective. So we give people that. So if you want to promote an idea, we have a structure for that. If you want to teach something, we have a structure for that. If you want to invite people to a party and actually get them to come, we actually have a structure for that. And so instead of starting with a scary blank page, people are just kind of filling the blanks. And then they can rearrange them just like a storyboard, just like Post-its on a wall, to be tailored to fit their story. So from the get-go, you're never faced by scary blank page. Instead, you get help and guidance all along the way with the scaffolding.
Wow, it sounds great. I actually want to use it now. So we have a couple of questions I'm going to read that are coming through from the audience. So the first one is, how did the engineers cope with the increased communication requirements with the rest of the team?
Yeah, good question. So part of it, one of the big benefits that we had is, there's a bunch of different ways you can increase communications load for people. One is just having more contact, and I think that's what the question's alluding to. There's definitely a lot more interaction. The other big cost for communications is the inefficiencies that come from having people playing the game of telephone amongst one another. Having a message from oh well, idea from something from a user is passed on to a product manager, who then passes on to a designer, who eventually passes on to an engineer. I think that's 4 different communications that just had to happen right there. And instead, with what we were doing is with Lean and with Voice, is just bringing all those together. So instead of having silos of design and engineering and product and user research, we were all just one big team. And so when we were doing at those, when I would bring in folks from a nonprofit like the San Francisco Bike Coalition would come into, I'd recruit them to come talk about some of their communication challenges in social media. And it wasn't just talking to me, the product manager. Just the engineers were all in the room, the designers were in the room, the user researchers were all of us. And so that just took out a ton of communications that would have had to happen. So you're not reading, you don't have 9 people reading the long, lengthy user research report that one person wrote. You just have everybody exposed to those ideas firsthand. And that really helped, I think, with communications. Another thing is more tactical, is just write everything down. Keep things and this is a mistake that we would make some at times, where we would make decisions and then have a meeting to make the same decision because it just wasn't documented. Oh yeah, what are our experiments? Oh, well, let's brainstorm and go through the whole process. Oh wait, we just ended up with the list that we came up with last week. So one of the benefits these days is like we have tools like Google Docs or Slack and all these wonderful things. So it's really easy to start like take charge and like keep those organized. It's those tools that the one thing to keep in mind is those tools are really flexible. So there's a lot of ways to use them, and things can emerge organically, but there's also crush that arises when you do it that way. So somebody, maybe you, whoever it is, like on your team, should just take charge and like push people to do things the right way. Like don't do it top down. Like see how patterns emerge. But if people start to like, oh, okay, they're using Slack to do like announcements of releases, like to create a new Slack channel just for announcement release things, and that way like milestones all go in this one place, like there's no mixed up discussions and it doesn't get lost. You don't have to create a new Google Docs where people have to open up a new browser window, like just keep it in one place. But it's kind of like the cow paths school of landscaping design, where you just, instead of like laying out the concrete sidewalks ahead of time, you just like let the grass grow, and then see as people are walking across the lawn, like you'll see the paths that people actually take, and then you find out the exact right paths, then just pave them over and make them pretty in concrete. This is the same thing with communications. Like let things organically emerge, but you're going to start to see patterns emerge strongly, and then like make them concrete so that people know what to expect.
That's a really good metaphor. It also sounds like you need to break down silos from the beginning. So collaboration is really important, but not sort of not thinking of people as engineer, designer, developer, but really just sort of one team around a product, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so another question. Sorry, I'm scrolling here. There's a bunch coming in. Did you get pushback from legal regarding the Creative Commons tie-in?
Yeah. So normally, if like typical big company, this is where I would like have some like chagrin about like legal, but actually like our legal team has been great, and they definitely like were warning us about various like best practices and things that we should do. Like we should one example is like we communicate that these like all the assets are tagged as Creative Commons assets, but like there are millions of them in the world from like all kinds of different sources across the web. So like we can't actually say they are like all like 100% Adobe guaranteed Creative Commons, but we can say like these have all been tagged as Creative Commons, and give people the information they need to the links and the backlinks and the proper attribution automatically. And so like in legal, so actually legal was kind of like part of the design process in that sense. Like that makes sense. Like we should communicate that, and we should be forward and honest with people. And so legal is just kind of helping us with that. So they were more supportive than anything.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of the fun. So in one of the surprising findings from one of our, I was going out to talk to a bunch of high school students about voice when we were doing some solution interviews. They had like 30 minutes. They used voice. They'd never used it, and they like did a whole film festival screening within like an hour, which was like super cool to see. But they, so I was asking them like things they liked, things they wanted to change, things they didn't like. Like one of the overwhelming things, like I was expecting the kids to be excited about, like, oh, like the awesome watercolor theme that makes it look like we're painting watercolors on the screen with a tap. But one of the favorite features from a bunch of the kids is like, oh, the best thing is like how it automatically attributes things. I'm like, well, like really? That's like not the sexiest feature. But yeah, so like voice will automatically like track people's Creative Commons attributions and automatically build a credit screen at the end of your video, like and take so to give proper credit to the artists as they're due. And like for kids, of course, in hindsight, it's like, yeah, it's such a pain to write a bibliography and keep track of like the 20 different images and where they came from and put it all together. They just love that voice did this automatically, and that's something that makes users happy and makes lawyers happy. Like they
that's
helps
cool.
everybody.
And actually, not what I would have guessed would be the sexiest feature either.
Yeah, me neither.
Pretty cool. This is actually a good question here. The next one is: how do you target your new product to such a wide range of audience, from professional use to school students, for example?
Yes, that's a great question. So this is actually one of the like things that I was pushing back against when I kind of heard about like next generation creative tools in this like effort at Adobe when I was joining. It's like so the team was recruiting me, and I was like, wait, so you're building tools for everybody except creative pros? Like that's like basically everybody in like 99% of the world. Like that's a broad target. Like that's the opposite of focus, right? I think that's why this is such a great question. So like of course like you should be focused, and I think when people there's a lot of, and this is some of the mistakes we made. Like at the beginning, there's like debates about like, oh, is this just like a general consumer tool for everybody, like the Instagram audience, and that entails so many things, and that's just it's really, I mean, you can be lucky and like get that right and like make an Instagram, but to be really deliberate, like you have to be so much more focused. And in the case of voice, even what it would do is like, oh, it would make videos. Like, well, what kind of videos, right? Like if you think about a tool like an iMovie, which is a great tool, or like a Premiere, which is a fantastic tool, people use them to make documentaries and vacation videos and music videos and narrated pieces and short 30-minute ads, like everything under the sun. And so it's really hard to be amazing in any of these things if you're trying to do all of those things. So in the case of voice, it was just by doing problem interviews with lots of customers, there were just patterns that started to emerge where there are certain people who had a specific intention, like I'm making a video to convince people to do this. That was a much more narrow band of videos. Like this isn't music videos. This isn't like a 3-hour documentary. This is I'm making a video to convince people to do something, like explainer videos, we call them today. And so that was, so when I pivoted voice to focus on explainer videos rather than like long random essays, that was a huge point for us. And even then, like I was wrong too. Like I was like, okay, so like examples of people who need these explainer videos, like, well, there's like nonprofits, there's small businesses, there's students and teachers, and startups. Like every startup needs to have like a explainer video, right? Like I see them everywhere. And that was my hypothesis. So we tested out by actually like showing the end result of what voice would create to people. And actually, this is actually a big thing. Like we didn't build the app. Like I personally, as like the product manager who doesn't know how to use After Effects and Premiere, these amazing video editing tools, like tried to learn them in a couple days and made a very terrible example video of like icons dropping onto the screen that happened to be perfectly in sync with the narration. And I showed this terrible video to people, and like I was thinking like this looks like a bad PowerPoint. But I'd show folks, and like teachers are like, oh my God, that's amazing. Like if we could make that, small businesses like, oh my God, that's amazing. Nonprofits, same thing. And the startups are like, oh, that's interesting. And like I thought they'd be so excited because like this is an explainer video. This is what you guys want. And they're like, yeah, like if we're willing to spend $10,000 to raise like $2 million in funding or whatever, or like $10 million in funding, like that's not a question for us. Or like we already have millions in funding. Like we'll pay $50,000 for an explainer video that makes our launch. And so like, oh, that makes sense. But so focus was so important, and so narrowing from like the world of everybody who wants to make a video into videos to convince people of a thing, even further to that specific subset of people who had particularly limited resources that needed to get the word out. And so again, like I was wrong. Like I totally thought startups would love this thing, and in hindsight, of course they wouldn't. Like they have other ways to do that. They can use After Effects. But yeah, it's important to choose an audience, even if you're wrong, and test it out rather than just saying like, oh, like I'm not going to make a guess, I'm not going to make a hypothesis, I'm just going to try everything. That's not going to get you anywhere. It's better to be focused, find out you're wrong, and pivot. I don't even know if it's called a pivot, but and try something else, and you're a lot likelier to get to your goal if you stay on target, stay on focus.
It's good to know who your customers are not going to be.
Exactly.
Okay, another question is, how big was the team? Can you comment on applying Lean Startup to a large geo-distributed team, if that's the case?
Yeah.
We'll start there.
Yeah, so the team is really small by big tech company standards. So I think started out we had like 4 or 5 engineers, product manager, design, so like less than 10 people. For sure. We did have the benefit that most of the team was co-located. Like we have some folks in San Jose and some folks in San Francisco, but at least a couple times a week, like everybody being in the same place, and that was definitely like a huge advantage I think we had, just because it was so much easier to have like a whiteboarding session kind of all together. And things like whiteboarding sessions are important because when you're rapidly prototyping things and sharing ideas with one another, like one, it's the speed of it isn't valuable, but the other part is that like things don't seem too concrete. Like when you're putting something in dry erase marker on a whiteboard, it looks kind of crappy, like a napkin sketch. And so other people are more likely to jump in and say like, no, that's wrong, or like, oh, maybe we should change it and do this. Whereas if we had like designers building like beautiful pixel perfect comps for every little design thing that they're coming up with, in practice, like when a designer shows that, it's really hard to say, oh, like maybe we should change that based on this feedback I just heard. Like, because you just spent like 5 hours working on this pixel perfect thing and it's beautiful. Like, I don't want to touch it. So having low fidelity ways of communicating was really valuable. Like in those whiteboard sessions altogether were great. I think that was important. But in fact, the larger team, so voice ties in a lot of things. Like we have like search capabilities that are like scouring the web and pulling Creative Commons images, and that were actually built by another group of folks like that were based in like Germany. So like we had remote folks like kind of distributed all over the place as well, even though the core team was in the Bay Area. And there, it's I mentioned before, like figuring out your lines of communication and making sure that people are using them consistently was kind of the way to go. So if we decided that like these things would happen in this Google Doc, then like be forceful at making sure everybody sticks to that. Like people will be tempted to be like, oh, no, I'm just going to send like this back and forth over email instead. But if you do that, then everybody has to keep an eye out on 2 different channels instead of one single channel. So I think distributed teams, it is a little harder. Like I totally admit that. But I think with the technology that we have, if you are disciplined in using it and using these collaboration tools to keep them simple for folks, instead of having like 20 million different tools or 20 different channels, you can go really far.
Yep. Okay, next question is, what and how did you measure progress in the Ginger project that led to Adobe Voice?
Oh, yeah, good question. So measuring progress. So there's all kinds of questions about this actually that we had, because we were asking this kind of same question, like what does traction mean exactly? Because if we didn't really have any comparables, this is a completely different audience for us of like kind of a more consumer-oriented tool rather than like a creative pro tool. And so at the beginning, I think we actually wasted a bunch of time, honestly, like debating well, what percentage conversion is good? And like so we would have like hour-long meetings about like debating this number, like what does success look like? We have to pick a number. And in practice, like it was better, it would have been better, and like what we ended up doing is like just doing it, and then like we would have a baseline, and then we could work on improving that baseline, right? So like I don't know if is 5% a good conversion for a validation website for this type of tool directed at this type of audience. Like I think now I guess I have a better idea, but like I don't know. There's so many different variables, honestly. But you know, I do know that like if it was 5% and we made a bunch of made some changes and did an experiment, and now it's 10%, like that's better. So I think that you know if you have the fortune of having like good comparables that you know to be the right comparables, that's great, and you can look at the absolute numbers and compare that way. But much more valuable is looking at like fractions, right? Like thinking about like growth or like increases and decreases, percents, right? So if it's a % improvement, that's a good thing, and you don't have to worry about like spending weeks doing the research to figure out what the right comparable absolute number is. So a lot of what Lean is about you know, trajectories, right? We talk about your goal is to get more validated learning, and that's about like knowing more than you did yesterday. And so if you keep on doing that, if every day you know more than you did yesterday, that's a good thing. If every day you're doing better than you did yesterday, no matter where you started from, that's probably going to be a good thing.
Yeah. So there's another question that asks, how did you organize the performance reporting about the progress in the Ginger project? So especially like on the executive level, how did you make your case?
Yeah.
As the information was coming in and you were making decisions.
Yeah. So what was the great thing and the scary thing about like a project like this at a big company is that, or at least at Adobe, like is that our management gave us the flexibility to like you decide what your KPIs are. Right? It's like what? Like oh, like but we don't know what we should be measuring exactly. We're still learning this as we go along. But again, that was like we just took stabs at those things. And I think one of the challenges we had is like Adobe's often a very data-driven company, like in terms of data-driven decisions, which is a great thing, and I think that's why like our products are like so successful. Part of why our products are so successful. But the downside of like one cultural downside of that is like when we on these new projects, and it's like okay, like what are the analytics that we're going to track? Everybody's so good at coming up with like every possible thing to track and like put a number on, and so like we end up with these like Google spreadsheets of like a million different things. Like that we would capture, and it's just like, and it's almost like a competition of like who could come up with the most like analytics that could be maybe interesting to capture, and like and people are very smart, and so that list gets very long. But actually, like it's just start simple. Like, because if you do that, like, you're going to spend so much time building up the frameworks and infrastructure to capture that like crazy long list of different analytics. Like, are those even going to be actionable at the end? Or are you going to have energy to act on them after you've like done all this work to collect them? So to focus on like the analytics that are going to be most actionable. Like, do some reverse engineering, right? Like, if we got this number, if we learned this number, what would we do with it? If you have no idea, like, maybe you don't need to collect it just right now, or maybe you don't have to stress about it just right now. So for us, it came, like, the simplification thing, like kind of thinking about, Dave McClure's like pirate metrics was actually super helpful for us. So just kind of acquisition, activation, retention, and revenue, and things like that. And that kind of list of things was a super like, you can pick and choose your framework, but just having something so that we were only focused on a single metric at a time was huge for us. So at the beginning, so like acquisition, kind of thinking about acquisition was big. So we were doing the validation website, and we could test our hypotheses about like, what would this product actually do? Like, what would we get? Would the like easy audio recording get people excited? Would the themes get people excited? Would the like integrated imagery and photos get people excited? So like we could actually test that and see like how many people were giving us their email addresses and like giving something up to get something in return. And that focus was just on acquisition at the time. Or actually, well, I guess activation on the website is how I should describe it as. And so it's just focused on activation. And that activation measure changed over time. Later on, of course, it was less the website and more like, were they activating, we changed what activation would mean in terms of like, our activation now means like, are they actually publishing a video successfully, like much later in the process. But each week we just had like one key metric that we were driving towards, and that enabled the focus that we were looking for. So that question of like, how do you choose? It's probably going to be one of those pirate metrics. Like, choose one and start with that and see where it goes, right? And keep on being able to iterate.
So one more question about sort of all the challenges you faced. Somebody asked what the biggest challenge was. So, and I would say I would ask that question not just for Adobe Voice, but for any of the other projects that you're working on that are where you're applying lean startup, or what is it? Presumably you've got buy-in already and people already have worked, and so that's not really a challenge anymore. But what is like the biggest thing that you had to overcome, if there's one?
Yeah, that's a
hard question.
It's a hard question. Good question. And partly it's hard just because not because there aren't so many challenges, but because like there are challenges across different dimensions, or like different kind of aspects of doing product development, like whether it's like design, the business side, the kind of product side. But picking one of them, I think that this is a challenge that people might not know they have. It's figuring out. So it's easy to everybody's bought into the idea of like, okay, you need to get closer to your customers to like build great products, to build products people love. Like, you need to understand them. You need to get out of the building. Like, I don't think there's any debate anymore about how important that is. Like, you're not going to guess at product requirements sitting inside of a meeting room, like disconnected from your users. But it's important not to just talk to users, but to talk to the right users, right? And I think that especially in a big company, but also even in small companies, like we actually have like usability, like we have a separate like usability research team, like organization at Adobe that has a separate function of people who do like usability, like recruiting specifically, and it's kind of shared across different organizations and different teams, and it's great to have resources like that. So if you're on the product team, it's very tempting to delegate like these things, like delegate like the dirty work of like the grind work of recruiting specific users to bring in for user tests or problem interviews or solution interviews or people to talk to. It's like, oh yeah, well, like I'm just going to write it like these parameters, like please find people that fit these parameters. But it's almost like hiring. Like like if you're hiring people, like it's nice to have like recruiters, but at the end of the day, like you need to get involved if you want to get like the best possible candidate, because like you need to understand, because at the end of the day, it's your job to understand them as the product person. So we'll have groups sometimes, like we'll use like things like usabilitytesting.com, which is great for like actual usability testing, like do people find the button and is the button in the right place? But early on, for a lot of teams, it was tempting for them to just like rely on tools like that for like understanding users and like developing empathy for users, and it's not a good tool for that, because those people have a different context, right? Like somebody who spends time like doing usability testing a few hours a week is different from like I'm looking for somebody like the retired lawyer who's sitting on the board of a nonprofit who's trying to like raise awareness about that nonprofit. Like her, and she has a fundraising gala that's happening next week. Like this is one of her contexts. Like how she responds to her product is going to be very different. She's going to be like a lot more it's going to be a lot more important that this thing is fast, that she gets results super quickly. Like she's not going to spend time on like coming up with her personal favorite color scheme because she's like a lawyer. Like she's like doesn't care. And so those details, like that real world context, is so important. So I would say it would be the biggest challenge for your lean startup process if you choose the wrong users, and that like, or you're talking to the people who aren't actually your users. So those things aren't fungible. So make sure that you're talking to the right users with the right context. And I think, and if you do that, you're going to learn a lot more valuable lessons from it.
That's a great answer. Okay, so I'm going to start to wrap it up because we've only got a few minutes left. But one of the questions that came up, and I'm just going to sort of ask it in a broad context, is what is Adobe's approach or your approach to innovation? So I mean, it's a lot of companies talk about innovation, and there are lots of different ways that you can think about it. But since you've sort of implemented Lean Startup and you're creating the next generation creative tools, how do you approach innovation, or how does the company approach it? Do you have a process in place, or is it sort of just an ethos in the organization that you also subscribe to?
So I think that so talking about like Adobe's ethos towards innovation is tricky, honestly, in that so we do a lot of it across a lot of different dimensions. So between like we have crazy like R&D researchers who are writing like amazing SIGGRAPH papers at like black magic things where you're like that shouldn't happen, and like stuff of science fiction, and like that's a type of innovation. There's like product innovation, there's design innovation, there's business innovation. So like I don't want to overspeak and speak to like the Adobe wide like innovation philosophy, because we do a lot of it, and we pick and choose the right philosophy for the right type of innovation, whether that's technical or business or product or the combination. So I'll speak to like kind of like I guess my personal thoughts on that, like much smaller scale. So I actually used to work. So before Adobe, I used to work at Reuters, like the news agency. They had a group called the Reuters Innovation Studio. So it's like, my first job out of college is like innovation strategist, which I don't think is a real thing. But so I kind of got immersed in that, and the way that was structured was that like we had this separate team in New York that was kind of doing like innovation projects, like doing user empathy, user research, ethnography, like understanding emerging technologies. We would synthesize that into like project plans, and then those would get disseminated to the rest of the organization, like around the world. And honestly, like that model, that's a really hard model where you have like innovation centralized in this little group of like innovation people. Like even though I was in that group, it was like hard because like you would do all this work, and then I would pass on this like deck, and then it may or may not actually happen. Like actually the process of getting buy-in, the process of getting the product people who are building it to like build empathy for this user that you were talking to and integrating with and engaging with this whole time, that was hard, if not like impossible in some cases. And so rather than have like thinking about like innovation being a centralized thing, like just a functional, like you're the innovator, think about how that could be woven into like the fabric of everyone in the organization, right? Like great ideas do come from everywhere, and instead, in D school we talk a lot, or the design school we talk a lot about T-shaped people, right? So T-shaped being like they have breadth in terms of like breadth across different disciplines. So like that person who's interested in photography and is an engineer who like loves literature and and then has depth in a particular area. Like they're a hardcore like computer science graphics researcher. Most people are that. They're not just these eye shapes. So encourage people to build like the breadth of their T. The interesting things happen. I always say like the most interesting stories happen at the intersections of things, right? And so encourage your staff, your team, yourself to explore different spaces, even in your personal life, like different disciplines, in addition to like, your professional like area of depth and expertise. And I think most of the most interesting innovations come from that place. If you think about something like Adobe Voice, why would anybody need to have like a background in like constructionist learning and education and design and like computer science. Like, why would those things ever connect? And voice is exactly that, right? And so I think, and that's why it's so different from every other movie tool that's ever been made, is because it comes at the intersection of things. So draw on that yourself, encourage your team to draw on that, and I think you'll do some pretty amazing, very innovative things.
That's a fantastic answer. Okay, so I have one more question that's come from the audience. I'm going to throw to you before I ask you the final question.
Sure.
How did you, and I sort of understand what they're saying. So how did you organize the involvement of the executive level so they could understand the experience of the learnings that you guys were getting? So did you bring them on any customer sort of visits, or did you demonstrate, or was it just strictly reporting to get them to?
Yeah. So I think if you could do that, I think that's a great idea, to be able to bring execs like into the field. Like I think in some previous projects, so we did a little bit of that. Like, but in the context of we didn't do that in the context of like these next gen tools, because like it's hard to get the CEO of like Adobe this time to like go visit like a specific user in that way. So if you can do that, that's great. In this case, kind of do the next best thing, which is whenever we were kind of reporting, typical kind of corporate reporting, you have your PowerPoint deck and a bunch of slides and a bunch of numbers and a bunch of bullet points. These are the new features that we worked on. This is the progress that we've made. This is our schedule. This is the timeline. Instead, as we were reporting on progress on these next-gen tools, we would always frame them in the context of a narrative. Right? And again, this is meta, because like I'm building a storytelling tool, so it's so weird that like I'm talking about like using storytelling to produce the storytelling tool. But it's effective in that. So instead of talking about like, oh, here's the new features we added in, we would talk about like, this is the story of a specific user that we have. So one amazing organization we were working with from the get-go, got us connected to a group called Groundworks Opportunities. GoWorks.org. It's a great local San Francisco nonprofit. It's kind of like a Kickstarter for causes in the developing world. And so we would tell their story, right? Like, and this is the founder, and this is the problem that he had, and like this is the solution, and like this is how he used our product, like the beta, the alpha of our product to create this thing, and this is the result they got, and this is why, and he's coming back because of this. So like they made like a gala explainer video, getting people to come, and like they got like way more, like 8 times more conversion on like this video that they made with our like beta tool. And you tell that story to people, like with this protagonist and the challenge and the thing that they overcame and the lesson they learned, and how they're coming back. Like it's really hard for it's really hard to you're pretty much guaranteed to get buy-in when you present people with that. And of course, like people, like the execs will then ask questions, and you can back it up with data and numbers. But the lead is the story of the people that you're helping. And yeah, I think that resonates with everyone.
That's great. All right, well, I'm really sorry that we're out of time, because this is such an awesome conversation. So I'm going to ask you one more question, and you know what I'm going to ask you. It's all about how creative you really are. What are you going to be for Halloween?
Yes. Ooh, tricky. So actually, my partner his company has a Harry Potter Halloween party, and so we will be going as the Weasley twins. So I think I have somewhere in this household we have an Amazon box with a can of orange hairspray or hair color spray. So I'll be looking pretty different in a few days.
Awesome, and it will be on Instagram, right? So
we'll see. We'll make some magic. I don't know if it'll be on Instagram.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today. It was great, and everybody that's listening and watching, you can see Tom at the Lean Startup Conference this fall, where you'll really get to dig into some of the great ideas and tips that he has for this stuff. So thank you so much. I'm going to hand it back to you, Jeanette.
Cool. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Christian.
Thanks to everyone for joining us today. This wraps up our show. Please join us again for the next webcast coming up real soon on November 2nd with Alexander Osterwalder, How to Design Lean Startup Culture. In the meantime, visit leanstartup.co for more information on the Lean Startup Conference, November 16th through 19th in San Francisco. Bye, everybody.